Chapter 35. Uncle David and Aunt Sylvia and Phyllis came in July to the Harbor Head Hotel but could only stay a week. They brought Phyllis over to Lantern Hill late one afternoon and left her there while they went to visit friends in town. "We'll come back for her around 9, said Aunt Sylvia, looking in horror at Jane, who had just got back from Queen's Creek, where she had been writing a love letter for Joe Gautier to his lady friend in Boston. Evidently, there was nothing Jane was afraid to tackle. She was still wearing the khaki overalls she had worn while driving loads of hay into the Jimmy John barn all forenoon. The overalls were old and faded and were not improved by a huge splash of green paint on a certain portion of Jane's anatomy. Jane had painted the old garden seat green one day and sat down on it before it was dry. Dad was away, so there was nothing to take the edge off Phyllis, who was more patronizing than ever. "Your garden is quite nice," she said. Jane made a sound remarkably like a snort. Quite nice, when everybody admitted that it was the prettiest garden in the Queen's Shore district, except the Titus ladies. Couldn't Phyllis see the wonder of those gorgeous splashes of nasturtiums when there was nothing finer in the county? Didn't she realize that those tiny red beets and cutting gold carrots were 2 weeks ahead of anybody else's for miles around? Could she possibly be in ignorance of the fact that Jane's pink peonies, fertilized so richly by Steppeyard's sheep manure, were the talk of the community? But Jane was a bit ruffled that day anyhow. Aunt Irene and Miss Morrow had been up the day before, having returned from Boston, and Aunt Irene, as usual, had been sweet and condescending, and as usual had rubbed Jane the wrong way. "I'm so glad your father put the telephone in for you. I hoped he would after the little hint I gave him." "I never wanted a telephone," said Jane rather sulkily. "Oh, but darling, you should have one when you're so much alone here. If anything happened—" "What could happen here, Aunt Irene?" "The house might take fire. It took fire last year and I put it out. Or you might take cramps in swimming. I've never thought it—" "But if I did, I could hardly phone from there," said Jane. "Or if tramps came. There's only been one tramp here this summer and Happy bit a piece out of his leg. I was very sorry for the poor man. I put iodine on the bite and gave him his dinner." "Darling, you will have the last word, won't you? So like your grandmother Kennedy." Jane didn't like to be told she was like her grandmother Kennedy. Still less did she like the fact that after supper, Dad and Miss Morrow had gone off by themselves for a walk to the shore. Aunt Irene looked after them speculatively. "They have so much in common. It is a pity." Jane wouldn't ask what was a pity, but she lay awake for a long time that night and had not quite recovered her poise when Phyllis came, condescending to her garden. But a hostess has certain obligations, and Jane was not going to let Lantern Hill down, even if she did make sundry faces at her pots and pans. The supper she got up for Phyllis made that damsel open her eyes. "Victoria, you didn't cook all these things yourself." "Of course. It's easy as wink." Some of the Jimmy Johns and Snowbeams turned up after supper, and Phyllis, whose complacency had been somewhat jarred by that supper, was really quite decent to them. They all went to the shore for a dip, but Phyllis was scared of the tumbling waves, and would only sit on the sand and let them break over her while the others frolicked like mermaids. "I didn't know you could swim like that, Victoria." "You ought to see me when the water is calm," said Jane. Still, Jane was rather relieved when it was time for Uncle David and Aunt Sylvia to come for Phyllis. Then the telephone rang, and Uncle David was calling from town to say they were delayed by car trouble and wouldn't likely be able to come till late. So could the Lantern Hill folks see that Phyllis got to the hotel? "Oh, yes, indeed," Jane assured them. "Dad can't be back till midnight, so we'll have to walk," she told Phyllis. "I'll go with you." "But it's 4 miles to the Harbor Head," gasped Phyllis. "Only 2 by the shortcut across the fields. I know it well." "But it's dark." "You're not afraid of the dark, are you?" Phyllis did not say whether she was afraid of the dark or not. She looked at Jane's overalls. "Are you going in them?" "No, I only wear these around home," explained Jane patiently. "I was driving in hay all the forenoon. Mr. Jimmy John was away, and Punch had a sore foot. I'll change in a jiffy, and we'll start." Jane slipped into a skirt and one of her pretty sweaters, and fluffed a comb through her russet hair. People were beginning to look twice at Jane's hair. Phyllis looked more than twice at it. It really was wonderful hair. What had come over Victoria anyhow? Victoria, whom she used to think so dumb. This tall arms and legs girl, who somehow had ceased to be awkward in spite of arms and legs, was certainly not dumb. Phyllis gave a small sigh, and in that sigh, though neither of them was conscious of it, their former positions were totally reversed. Phyllis, instead of looking down on Jane, looked up to her. The cool evening air was heavy with dew when they started. The winds were folded among the shadowy glens. The spice ferns were fragrant in the corners of the upland pastures. It was so calm, and still you could hear all kinds of faraway sounds. A cart rattling down Old Man Cooper's Hill, muted laughter from Hungry Cove, an owl on Big Donald's Hill calling to an owl on Little Donald's Hill. But it got darker and darker. Phyllis drew close to Jane. "Oh, Victoria, isn't this the darkest night that ever was?" "Not so very. I've been out when it was darker." Jane was not in the least scared, and Phyllis was much impressed. Jane felt that she was impressed. Jane knew she was scared. Jane began to like Phyllis. They had to climb a fence, and Phyllis fell over it, tore her dress, and skinned her knee. So Phyllis couldn't even climb a fence, thought Jane, but thought it kindly, protectively. "Oh, what's that?" Phyllis clutched Jane. "That? Only cows." "Oh, Victoria, I'm so scared of cows. I can't pass them. I can't. Suppose they think—" "Who cares what a cow thinks?" said Jane superbly. She had forgotten that she had once been fussy about cows and their opinion of her. And Phyllis was crying. From that moment, Jane lost every shred of her dislike of Phyllis. Phyllis, patronizing and perfect in Toronto, was very different from a terrified Phyllis in a back pasture on an island hill. Jane put her arm around her. "Come on, honey. The cows won't even look at you. Little Donald's cows are all friends of mine. And then it's just a walk through that bit of woods and we'll be at the hotel." "Will you walk between me and the cows?" sobbed Phyllis. Phyllis, holding tightly to Jane, was safely convoyed past the cows. The little wood lane that followed was terribly dark, but it was short, and at its end were the lights of the hotel. "You're all right now. I won't go in," said Jane. "I must hurry home to get some supper ready for Father. I always like to be there when he comes home." "Victoria, are you going back alone?" "Of course. How else would I go?" "If you'd wait, Father would drive you home when he comes." Jane laughed. "I'll be at Lantern Hill in half an hour, and I love walking." "Victoria, you're the very bravest girl I ever saw in my life," said Phyllis earnestly. There wasn't a trace of patronage in her tone. There was never to be again. Jane had a good time with herself on the walk back. The dear night brooded over her. Little wings were folded into nest homes, but there was wild life astir. She heard the distant bark of a fox, the sound of tiny feet in the fern. She saw the pale glimmer of night moths and took friendly counsel with the stars. Almost they sang, as if one star called to another in infinite harmony. Jane knew them all. Dad had given her lessons in astronomy all summer, having discovered that the only constellation she knew was the Big Dipper. "This won't do, my Jane. You must know the stars. Not that I blame you for not being well acquainted with them. Humanity in its great lighted cities is shut out from the stars, and even the country folk are too used to them to realize their wonder. Emerson says something somewhere about how marvelous a spectacle we should deem them if we saw them only once in 1,000 years." So with Dad's field glasses, they went star hunting on moonless nights, and Jane became learned in lore of far-off suns. "What stars shall we visit tonight, Janelet? Antares? Fomalhaut? Sirius?" Jane loved it. It was so wonderful to sit out on the hills with Dad in the dark and the beautiful aloneness, while the great worlds swung above them in their appointed courses. Polaris, Arcturus, Vega, Capella, Altair. She knew them all. She knew where to look for Cassiopeia enthroned on her jeweled chair, for the milk dipper upside down in the clear southwest, for the great eagle flying endlessly across the Milky Way, for the golden sickle that reaped some harvest of heaven. "Watch the stars whenever you are worried, Jane," said Dad. "They'll steady you, comfort you, balance you. I think if I had watched them years ago, but I learned their lesson too late."